under which any future private land holdings in Alaska would have been created is in the context of the native claims settlement. And the 40 million acres the natives will get will be probably for the next century at least 9/10 of the total land held in private in fee in the state, and probably in the vicinity of 97%. So that when it comes to private land ownership, that is it. And so saying, I introduce Roger Lang from the Alaska Federation of Natives, who will, and this may be a prediction, that within 5 years he'll be regarded as a representative of the vicious exploiters, the land trust, and the baddies, rather than the emergent goodies in this state.
For that introduction, thank you. That guy in the end thinks he's got a movie image to overcome. You ought to think about the ones that I represent. What's happening is Arlon very, in his inimitable manner, very succinctly said what the hell's happening in Alaska. He's also said that it's not very well generally recognized, and that's true. It's not recognized by the financial world, the political world, conservation world, the boomer world, or any other world. But what's happening is that it is a fact. And that it's new to Alaska. Frankly, it's new to the United States. And the effort is to quickly place us in an either-or category. Either we're going to be boomers in 5 years, or we're going to be conservationists recognized maybe in 100 years. But, you know, like every other citizen of the United States, we reserve a right to change our mind, with this single exception that when we change our mind, it will have an impact upon the land use patterns in Alaska. Now, you must remember that the genesis of the Claims Settlement Act is not the corporate or the financial picture. Those are alien things to us. The genesis of the act is land. That's what it was all about. If you don't believe it, I advise you to read that thing. The land formula was fought, was battled, was compromised, was rewritten, probably in 28 separate bills, ending up in a conference committee in which we couldn't take apart, but in which we could kick and scream outside the door. The land section comprises probably 2/3 of the treatment of the bill. The finance you can find in 3 paragraphs. Corporate structure in the village level in 1, and the regional level in 2. Give you some importance that Congress gave into the organization and the finance. They spent a lot of time on lands. And the problem that's facing land ownership and land philosophies are 2. One, that the land were placed in 3 different categories, probably 4. The immediate ones are the village ownership, land ownership, and the regional land ownership. The village ownership is only surface rights, and as such represents a much more traditional use of the land than anything else. Generally, the resources found in surface lands are renewable resources. We have to separate, when we think about land use management, from renewable resources to non-renewable. The regions own all 40 million acres of subsurface land. And as such, their development and their research and their look at lands is not the traditional look of the Alaskan native. And because of this, there have been contracts for exploratory rights. For some regions have signed a contract with ERTS for the big brother in the sky to spy for us and give us an overview of some land management. But all of these things, the surface, the subsurface, generally tie, in our minds, quickly to traditional uses. I think it was best said by Jimmy Huntington at our AFN convention in a similar panel where we talked about our immediate problem of subsistence hunting and fishing. And here again, you know, the effort has been to place us as yes, we're for the Secretary's plan for withdrawal, or yes, we're for the Federal State Land Use Planning Commission's plan for withdrawal, simply because it relates to subsistence hunting and fishing, or yes, we're for state management of that, or yes, we're for the Secretary's management. And we can't this quickly be placed into those types of things. Part of the problems with those things that we find is that there are two. In land use philosophy in the renewable resource field, the state is way behind. It has none that we can find that covers the entire state. Federal State Land Use Planning Commission is fast coming to that conclusion, but we feel there's something missing there too, simply because land use planning minus the cooperative management agreements that Jack Hessian spoke of earlier are worthless. Because face it, out there it's going to be a wilderness until you build a road. It's going to be a wild and scenic river until you build access. It's going to remain what it is right now and not be marred by either snowmobiles or trapping or hunting and fishing, because that's the way it's been for a long time. And it'll continue in that vein unless it is marred up, bunged up, or goofed up by the introduction of other things. Those other things are two. One is access, two is the Caucasian economy. Once we get those things out there, then there are serious problems without cooperative management agreements to land use planning. Simply because wild and scenic rivers, game refuges, National Park Service, even the National Forest Service, whom I used to work for, don't have enough bodies other than cooperative management agreements for the policing of any management tool that they come up with. It'd be useless to tell somebody in Shaktoolik you can't go a quarter of a mile more up the river and snag a humpy or a dog salmon, because that belongs to the Wild and Scenic Rivers or National Park Service or whatever. He'll go get it anyhow. If he needs to eat it, he's going to get it. Without cooperative agreements, you're in trouble. But I got to get back to the philosophies, because that's where it all began. The philosophies are that we shall be either boomer, conservative, or whatever. And the practicalities are that we're going to be all three. Hopefully without upsetting traditional uses of land on surface resources and renewable resources. I think what's being introduced into the corporate world, along with the fact that Alaska Natives will own most of the land, Arlon forgot to say that when Congress did that, they also introduced a corporate system to Alaska. They introduced it in a big way as 211 village corporations, be 12 regional corporations. That's only the beginning. You know, I think there will almost never be a time when management philosophies will be a total native view representing 211 villages and 12 regional corporations, simply because of the geography, the location, and the realization that the potential necessary for economic survival out there will be joint ventures, will be new corporations, and will be new fields for financial participation. Those are all brand new subjects for consideration by Alaska Natives. I think also being developed into the corporate structures a new definition of, quote, profit, either corporate or individual. In our case, it might never be mentioned, might never be measured in dollars, might be measured in other ways. And I've got, I think, enough of a grasp of what's happening to the regional corporation that I personally am a part of. I'm from Southeast, and I'm on the board of directors of Alaska Corporation. And as such, I'm very aware that there are people, simply because timber's in almost as great a demand as oil right now, who generally want to boom that phase of our operations. You know, our villages have had, oh man, foreign people, people representing foreign interests come and make bids on their oil, offer better lives for villages as it relates to employment and whatever, some steady employment. And I'm somewhat grateful for the wisdom of the villagers for the region that I'm from, because so far they've said no to everybody and said to us, hey, you've made your mandatory distribution, you've given us money, why don't you put it all back in a lump and put it away for us and let it grow in one big lump as opposed to 10 little ones, while we develop some plans that will relate to the very old and to the very young. That means, hey, they're going to look to the far future for the use of their lands. The simple fact is that in philosophies which relate to land, the native life of Alaska relates very heavily either to the river or the sea at the same time. This introduces something new to thinking because, frankly, we're going to get title to and ownership of all non-navigable rivers and streams. Very interesting concept. A renewable resource that comes back every 2 years, as opposed to trees that grow in 50 or oil that never comes back. But hey, maybe the accent will be not so much on development and use of land, which somewhat relates to the boomer philosophy and to the development of subsurface resources, as it does to the more quickly renewable salmon industry. It's a good thought. Aquaculture is going to be a thing in this state. I always relate when I talk to groups such as this that the first person hired by the Bristol Bay Native Corporation wasn't a geologist, he wasn't an archaeologist, he wasn't any of those other ologists, he was a fish biologist. And that was the first landman that the Bristol Bay Native Corporation hired. And I think that trend will probably hold very true. I think if you look at the location of all those little black dots, they're either on a bay, a river, or a stream. All of them relate to that renewable resource. And studies are quickly coming out which show that aquaculture isn't a bad thing, providing you don't rely too heavily on biologists and let God, nature, and the stream take care of what's there. I would like to somewhat conclude by saying that I can't enunciate a native philosophy on land use any more than the good gentleman on the right can enunciate one for the oil companies, or Arlon can give me one for the United States, or for anybody. There is, as of this date, to my knowledge, no native philosophy for land use. I think there will be one developed, though, and it directly relates to your 5 questions, Arlon, because I answered them. It seems inevitable that there will be substantial conflict among various land use philosophies. Assuming that it's not possible to make everybody happy all the time, what is the best way to minimize these conflicts? I think that's simple. It's to consider the highest citizenry use of that land, wherever it's at, and that resource. And that's all. Economics will come anyhow. To minimize conflict, all you do is satisfy the people that you're talking about. Is comprehensive land use planning, which considers full range of alternatives, the best way to do this? No. I don't agree to that because I've been, in my limited experience, in several areas where attempts have been made to use comprehensive plans for economic development, comprehensive plans for land use in planning and zoning in a borough that I used to be the presiding officer of. That was only 5 years ago. I could go back today and find out quickly how limited I was in my view of comprehensive land planning. I think it needs to go on. I don't see any alternative to comprehensive land use planning, but I see the great sin is that the Federal State Land Use Planning Commission will be phased out. As their plan becomes implemented, they're no longer there to adjust, to amend, to change, and to reassess. Part of the best process of Americans America's history is that there is time for amendatory processes. You know, we do have the waves of ecology, and we have the waves of boom. We have all of these waves, but we amend very strongly and sometimes not very wisely. We do have an amendatory process that is built into our citizens' rights. And I think comprehensive land use planning just by itself will never solve the problem. Are present land use planning systems adequate? The answer is no. Do they identify a full range of alternatives? No. Are they able to measure the costs and benefits of the various alternatives? No. Simply because that's a state, you know, that picture over there. And I'm relating this to Alaska, and that's all. I somewhat agree with Arlon that land use planning systems, we get buried, frankly, not by laws legislatively enacted, but by the policies generated after. Those tend quickly to assume effective law once they've been in establishment for over 2 years. And once you deal with policies as opposed to politicians, then you get to the buck-passing phase of our citizenry. You know, I've been to D.C. where big signs say the buck stops here. That's a lie. The buck never stops in this country, whether it's there or not. You get to him and he'll just start putting you back until you found where the original buck was. But I think that present methods and procedures for land management decisions, which take into account social, economic, and ecological concerns. The question is, do? My answer is no. No, because it is the general assumptions of the citizenry of the state of Alaska that all things begin equal. You know, our education system is the same in Chaktulik as it is in Anchorage. Our delivery system for health is the same. Our lifestyle is the same. Our economics are the same. That's not true. No. We can't even define the economic portion of subsistence hunting. You know, that relationship to the native life in rural Alaska. I've been a long time listening to a lot of experts. I can't do it myself. The economic impact of removing that as a lifestyle and replacing it with, quote, cash, has serious, significant impacts. And we can't define those. We don't, while we like to, we don't do it. In the past, the interests of the state of Alaska, Alaska natives, conservationists, developers, and the federal government have been characterized as conflicting. Are these interests always in conflict? Assuming there are conflicts, how should they be resolved? And here, answer yes, they are in conflict. 2, I don't think they should be resolved. 2, I like boomers knocking on my door while the conservationists are standing at the other window scratching and saying, "Don't do it, Indian." You know, I like conflict. Because, frankly, you know, in the unique lifestyle of the Alaska Native and the introduction of land, money, and the corporate structure, finally we're able to pick and choose how we're going to use fee simple lands and our money. Because Arlon forgot one other thing when he was establishing our land base, is that for the first time in the history of the American treatment of their Indians, there are no strings on the use of money, our money. There is no bureaucratic oversight. There is no BIA management. There are no investment nor what do they call it? Social and welfare programs built into the use of our money. The sad fact is that we're only limited by our imaginations. And as such, I think we need conflict. We need a reassessment. I need a reassessment of the state's management practice of renewable resources. You know, I'd like to find one that the feds have. I haven't found one yet. And I used to work, excuse me, Barney, for the Forest Service. And now I'm in the same boat as the Forest Service. The people that I represent in my corporation have money. I have to become concerned about sustained yield and all these little quote practices that the federal government used to give for us. So I would assume that should we ever resolve conflict, we would have to do something I advocated to the Republican dinner to which I was invited to speak a few days ago. One is we're going to have to blow up the Alcan Highway and stop that population impact, you know. And we're going to have to do other things while we sit back and assess and make up our mind. I think that probably native philosophy as of today, you know, 1974, is that we don't have one. We like your conflicts. We welcome them, and we'll learn a hell of a lot from them. Thank you.
Let's have Ted Bingham from the Land Use Planning Commission next. Let me throw out a question I didn't ask here, and this is a more specific question. How many of you, I know Don has, heard of the concept of a direct finding tool? Well, you all know that the only way you find out whether there's oil and gas under a particular tract of land is to drill. We're coming closer and closer to the point where we can determine with a very high degree of confidence whether and how much, whether there are hydrocarbons and how much there are. Mobil estimates that within 3 years they will be to the point whereby geophysical and geochemical techniques will be able to determine whether or not there is an oil field and make some order of magnitude notion of just how, the quantity of hydrocarbons that can be found. Now this, I don't know whether this is true, and I don't know when the impact of this development will actually begin to take hold. It could open up an entire new finding cycle in North America, a way of going after the oil in stratigraphic traps that's been discovered in the past only by accident. And as oil is in the East Texas field, it seems to me that it might have a very significant impact on the kind of deliberations that Alaskans and the nations going over in classification and disposal of land in Alaska. And the question I want to ask, suppose 10 years down the road we discovered there were 30 billion barrels of oil in place under the Arctic wildlife range. What do we do? Or suppose we have a direct finding tool that does not affect the surface, does not make any, does not have any significant adverse environmental impact. Are we going to oppose the exploration of the Arctic wildlife range because we might discover 30 billion or 50 billion barrels of oil in place there, and that would open this Pandora's box? Suppose at the same time there's a possibility that it will be found that there is no significant commercially recoverable oil in the western half of PET 4. How do you go about, should the various interests consider a swap in that case? The point I want to ask specifically to the remaining people, and maybe to the whole panel when they get around to discussing things, is that what will be the impact on your respective philosophies and even if you don't change your philosophy, on the land management institutions you favor, if it is indeed possible to determine with a relatively high degree of confidence where the valuable minerals are located. And the rhetorical point here is that we may well be, that everything we say today may be well overwhelmed by the course of events. For example, the development of new technology or $10 barrel oil, which may change which very well may change what we believe about a lot of these things too, and I won't spend the time to suggest some of the consequences if oil remains at $10 a barrel, some of the consequences for the state's development. Ted?
So technology increases, and what do we do, is what you're basically saying, I think. Good morning. Use philosophies, as Arlon started out with his boomer conservationists and new environmentalists, I see as a new definition for multiple use, single use, and dominant use. Basically, the question that's been asked to the panel in relating use philosophies to management or management systems, I think as has been expressed by those before me on this panel, it creates a number of problems in initially trying to define what you're playing with. I'd like to approach this from the aspects of, one, what is a use philosophy and where does it come from? And I use a jumbled stack of pyramids, if I may, to illustrate it, in that if you start with a small pyramid, which represents you as an individual, and increase that with your family, your neighborhood, your clubs, cliques, clans, groups, whatever, as you grow these in size to your neighborhood, your community, your state, your federal and your international situation, you get an extreme complexity of two things. One, the impact on your own philosophy, i.e. how has your philosophy changed by your relationship to others. And two, how as in larger and larger groups, our philosophies directed toward more of a single approach or single entity, and I don't care whether that's single use, new environmentalist, boomer, oil exploration, oil production, mineral extraction, or whatnot. But I think you find that as a group or area of people or interest expands in its size or numbers of people involved, that either this use philosophy becomes very pointed or it becomes very broad, depending on the tightness or looseness of that organization or that group of people. You start looking at management, and I think you will find the reverse is true. At your higher levels of groups, i.e. at the federal level, you have, 7 or 8 departments. Each department's got umpteen bureaus. Each bureau has their oar in a particular stream, and their paddles in everybody else's stream. So that you find in, I believe in the case of the Alyeska pipeline proposal, Alyeska is dealing with some 35 or 40 offices of government at the federal level, a half dozen or so at the state level, and I don't think anybody's bothered to count what they may be at local levels. In this aspect, then, how do we relate a multitude of philosophies through some semblance of management aspects, and then I'll also answer Arlon's last question of what happens with change in technology. If we look at use philosophies in what may be called the multiple use, boomer use, or use by occupants, as I call it, those who are adjacent or on the property, are normally those who are seeking an economic return or a livelihood return or something of this nature, in which case they are going to be quite flexible in their use because they are going to be the first to want to change with changing conditions. If the fish no longer come up the stream, that group of natives that Roger Lang was speaking of is going to have to move or change or seek some other source of subsistence. Therefore, they might be called boomers from that aspect. They must move to where they can live with it. The conservationist philosophy may be called the dominant use philosophy, or you may consider it the visitor or the casual user. Let us use it, but let us retain it so that if and when I get there, I may also use it myself. Your environmentalists, single use, etc., if you get into this, you are looking at something that is essentially rarely physically used. Let us save it for future use, in so many words. Let us not use it with mechanized vehicles, or let us not use it in harvesting crops, be they trees, minerals, or otherwise, because this will change its condition. In some cases, the non-use changes it as well. In the management aspect, even if you disregard levels of government, you have to look at the current separation of powers between segments of the government. What is the relationship, for instance, under ANSCA of the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture over the so-called D2 lands? Who wields which whip in deciding which decision? When you bring in more than one level of government, as we are involved with here in Alaska in a choice of something under ANSCA, you not only have it within the level of government, but between the levels of government. I think this is where one starts to look at what may be called the cooperative agreements or coordinated programs, coordinated planning, or whatever you wish to call it, between these various levels or divisions of government. Another item I think you will find in looking at management, as the lower the level of government in this management, the more and more the term economics enters into the picture. Even with the private ownership, and I think the native entities are beginning to express this, they must be viable to stay around. To be viable means economics. Not sure if it was Mr. Lang or others from the Federation of Natives who have basically stated the regional corporations must be profit-making, period. In fact, wording of the act is such that if one of them is not profit-making, the others are going to have to share it, so it is profit-making. Somehow, some way, somebody, some group, some government has to be able to analyze use philosophies and direct some semblance, some coordination or decision between some of these various use philosophies to the management functions. At the same time, it must be aware of technology change, because as technology changes, the values change, the ability to use or not use change, etc. I think it was John Cratula from Resources of the Future that espouses what is known as, referred to as the transformation function, which says if you have a unit of irreplaceable resource, that is a resource that never can be replaced over a reasonable period of time, that the public good is best served by holding the price of utilizing that resource up to the highest maximum the public will stand. Now, how far does the public go before they allow a Transalaska pipeline? I think this is something that we can look at over a short history here in Alaska. For 3 or 4 years, at least so far, there was not a public outcry really to allow it. Last year, Congress said allow it, in so many words. An energy crisis, good, bad, or indifferently, as you may feel about it, brought around a decision that basically said develop North Slope oil because we need it for some purpose. If you can adequately analyze your use philosophies, I think you have a choice between two methods of applying it. That is either to have a very strong single government entity that is highly flexible and may change its management of any particular piece of land overnight. And this, one might say, is the complete multiple use concept. Or you have to develop at some point in time that will be good for a number of years, and again, I don't know the number of years, but for a longer period of time, a designation area by area, which would be managed by an agency that has no flexibility. Neither one works, but we don't like what we have today, we don't like what we had yesterday, and who knows what we'll have tomorrow. They're both bothered with changes in society. The ability to modify with changes in society is one of the things that we are lacking. I don't think we can have it without a change in society's philosophy. I don't think we can have proper management without a healthy increase in communications, not only between managing agencies, if you have more than one, but between the levels of government and the users who develop the philosophies that we should follow in management. One of the main problems that I see is what I call the accept me philosophy of our society. All decisions are good decisions if they don't affect my position. Basically, one says, either give the administrator the discretion he, quote, needs, or limit his discretion, as you want to look at it, to that amount of discretion or flexibility that serves my purpose but does not do away with my purpose. And I don't care whether your purpose is boomer, environmentalist, visitor, occupant, or whatnot. To Arlon's question on the oil finder, whatever it may be, I'll leave you Catullus' transformation function. The answer on some of the other questions dealing with comprehensive planning or philosophical conflicts, if we cannot have conflicts, we cannot have meaningful discussions, and decisions that do not come from meaningful discussions are adverse to all. Decisions that can come from discussion of an item can be more acceptable to more people. They may be just as bad as the individual's decision. I must agree with Roger Lang on most of his answers to the balance. They are not the best. They are all we have, and today we cannot do without. The question I would leave with the audience here is, how do you get your use philosophy across to the manager who manages your property, be it your home, be it your national forest, or be it this unknown land out here that either is going to be selected by the natives, placed in a park, drilled for oil, or dug up for minerals, or left holding Alaska together. It is in this field that I think the managers, the decision makers, have got to have your input, and they've got to converse amongst themselves and between themselves. Thank you.
And I see Celia Hunter is here today representing the Wilderness Society. I don't know anybody in the state who has worn more hats in the last 9 or 10 years I've been here, but I do recognize that Celia has been one of the most articulate, effective, continuing spokesman for a certain philosophy, no matter what particular organization she's been representing. That as she advanced that philosophy.
Thank you, Arlen. I certainly feel that the panel thus far has covered a great deal of ground in discussing use philosophies. I think the topic, when it was given to me, was, I felt it was extremely nebulous and one which had, you could take off in any direction that you feel like. I'd like to correct one error that I think Ted Bingham was expressing, in that he was saying that as far as the new environmentalists are concerned, they are the single-use people, the ones who can only see one value in anything, and that they want to preserve it at all costs. And I think that this is not quite a what Arlen had in mind, or what the new environmentalists have in mind when they start talking about use of natural resources or use of any resources. I think I was trying to jot down a few things that the new environmentalist philosophy means to me. And it's one which I think most of your conservation organizations are espousing at the present time. It is a basic feeling that spaceship Earth is a finite system with definite limits to the amount of manipulation that man may exert upon it without interfering with successful functioning of the system. And I think that, in the second place, in assessing the needs of human beings and the needs which are represented in land use plans, that the quality of life or the livability of a particular environment are factors which now are being given more and more importance in determining what uses are made and how we make our decisions as to the final land use plans of whatever sort. We found out, I think, that material well-being is a fundamental to human beings, but it isn't the only component of human happiness. And some way must be found to incorporate intangible benefits into any land use plan. In approaching this, we're getting into a time crunch for questions in the audience, and I'm not going to go into this all fully. I would like to just present you with about three things here. One of them is a land ethic statement made by Aldo Leopold in Sand County Almanac. I think Aldo Leopold was probably the pioneer new environmentalist, because he was thinking of the earth as a whole long before it became fashionable for many others to think about it. And his statement here about the land ethic, I think, is something that each one of us should take home and think about. He states, the key log which must be moved to release the evolutionary process for a land ethic is simply this: quit thinking about decent land use as solely an economic problem. Examine each question in terms of what is ethically and aesthetically right, as well as what is economically expedient. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise. It, of course, goes without saying that economic feasibility limits the tether of what can or cannot be done for land. It always has and it always will. The fallacy the economic determinists have tied around our collective neck, and which we now need to cast off, is the belief that economics determines all land use. This is simply not true. An innumerable host of actions and attitudes, comprising perhaps the bulk of all land relations, is determined by the land user's tastes and predilections, rather than by his purse. The bulk of all land relations hinges on investments of time, forethought, skill, and faith, rather than on investments of cash. As a land user thinketh, so is he. I think he has made a statement which fundamentally expresses the predicament that we find ourselves in, because whether we are looking at private land which we own in fee simple title as an individual, or whether we are the managers of public lands, as you think about that land, as you look at it in terms of your philosophy, determines to a great extent what you are going to allow to be done to that land and what you are going to try to do with that land. And it has, the economic returns are almost incidental in that way of thinking. I think of an example of some miners who are now operating out in the Kantishna, and fundamentally I think I've always been considered to be an opponent of miners. After all, they tear up the countryside and all that sort of thing. But I think the thing that I am opposed to is the useless destruction of land without any regard for who comes after. And I think there's one small outfit down there in the Kantishna that I really take off my hat to, because it's a family unit from Juneau who are exploiting a silver deposit there in the Kantishna. And even though they are very small and fundamentally you would think that they had to take a lot of shortcuts because they don't have the money, they don't have the capital to do the sorts of conservation measures that are needed in a mining operation, they are managing to do as little damage as possible in their operation because they're thinking about it. They have, there's a certain amount of destruction that goes into going in and sinking a shaft and getting ore out and hauling it down to their little mill. And you have to admit this, but when they get it down there and what they do with their waste is really a revelation, because they have taken the trouble to make a lot of settling pools so that none of this wastewater, this waste silt-laden stuff, and it also has acids in it, ever reaches Moose Creek. Everything is short-stopped before it gets there, and they are doing their best to create around their establishment, to leave it as it is and to keep the natural beauty to the greatest extent possible. So it is more the way you look at a project than it is necessarily the economic return that it gives. Another thing that I just wanted to touch on lightly in terms of the land use planning, which has gone on in the past, and some of the fetters that we have had in thinking about how to manage the land that we have been put together in fairly concrete form here. And I'd just like to run through these because I think they illustrate what has been our problem to date in land use planning. During the first 6 decades of the 20th century, primary attention has been focused piecemeal upon the short-range, uncoordinated planning, promotion, and development of individual components of the economy and the environment, such as transportation, industrial production, agricultural production, forest production, energy supplies, water development, health, education, recreation, fish and wildlife, and wilderness preservation. The promotion, development, and preservation goals have been further fragmented into small individual units by mission-oriented private concerns, cities, counties, etc. Our decisions frequently have been based upon the perspective of individual disciplines with few cross-ties to weigh the overall relevance of separate partial analyses. Little effort has been devoted to assessing the long-range cumulative effects of all these activities upon the livability of everyone in an entire state, multi-state region, or the nation as a whole. Little effort has been devoted to influencing optimum long-range growth trends. Historical trend economic projections, including some consideration of individual resource capability, frequently have been accepted by planners and decision makers as goals and are used to forecast the long-range needs and demands for other national and local programs such as public lands and resources, transportation, energy supply, housing, health, and education. This type of economic projection has proven to be reasonably accurate forecast. During the past 50 years, no other system for identifying goals has been readily available. However, this historical trend projection frequently ignores natural resource supply constraints, assumes unlimited growth, and fails to quantify either the combined capacity of all natural resources to sustain growth or the effect that the projected growth in economic development would have on the livability, the congestion, the air and water pollution, and the natural or intangible values. Both the material elements and the intangible elements are essential to the realization of the desired quality of life. But one of the greatest potential threats this nation faces is that the intangible values will be irretrievably destroyed during the pursuit of short-term material values. Planning decisions have tended to become decisions as to when, where, and how a project can be built to meet future needs. Thus, projections of economic and population trends have become self-fulfilling prophecies. And I think we've seen that type of approach all too often in all of the planning heretofore, where we decide that in so and so many years we're going to have such and such a population, and therefore we must plan for it, and therefore in so and so many years we get that much population because we have planned for it. This seems to me a rejection of the true function of planning, which is to set a goal and then decide how you get to that goal, rather than just assuming that forces have to be met and that we are going to meet them, and therefore we have to do these things. The question before us is, what do these observations have to say to Alaska citizens, Alaska resource managers, and planners about our present situation? I think they have much to say as part of a preliminary discussion about the future of Alaska. These discussions are typified by this panel, and also by the Humanities Forum Symposium series, which is beginning tomorrow, called Lifestyles in the Land. They're worthy endeavors. I might mention they have a serious handicap in that they tax both our attention span and our sitting capabilities by the time we try to participate in very many of them. We're facing a crucial span of time in Alaska's history, with the final settlement of the native claims under ANCSA, with the creation of additional federal lands within the four systems, and with selection and patenting of the remaining portion of those lands. Given the state of Alaska, we will have one of the most complicated land ownership patterns imaginable. If we attempt to direct the destinies of these lands through the type of sloganeering which has passed for thought in the past, we court disaster. We've heard much during these sessions about an Alaskan lifestyle, about the quality of life we presently enjoy here in our first-class compartment within spaceship Earth. Yesterday, Red Boucher mentioned a historical assessment of the real basis for Alaska's future prosperity: our wilderness, our clean air, our clean water. To protect these irreplaceable assets, we need something more as a guideline than the hazy policy popularly known as multiple use. To many of those espousing the multiple use concept, the word means literally that we will permit all of those uses desired by any or all people on all public land, regardless of the cost and environmental decay. As any land manager, whether in the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, or any other agency, knows, this is not how it should work. Multiple use is visualized in the Act giving the Forest Service a mandate to protect it, provides guidelines for determining those lands suitable for specific purposes. And among these purposes are such items as watershed protection, preservation of fish and wildlife habitat, recreation, and even wilderness. Primary use and single use are inherent aspects of good multiple use. I think what I would like to ask of this group, and perhaps this is the effort which the Federal State Land Use Planning Commission should be focusing on more than any other, is that we need to establish certain goals for the future of Alaska and to guide our development and our land use planning toward these specified goals. It's very nebulous. It's very hard to set them up. I can certainly sympathize with Roger Lang and the fact that the natives do not have a native philosophy of land use. The non-indigenous natives of Alaska certainly don't have any philosophy of land use either. But I think that this is one of the primary goals, one of the primary means that we have of making sure that we don't just simply project an unlimited growth for the future of Alaska and tie ourselves to trying to run very fast and catch up with that in all of the aspects that it means. Access is one of them. We can sit here and build roads from now to doomsday, and what we are losing in social and cultural benefits and that sort of thing through the building of unplanned roads will certainly foreclose many of the values which those lands have for the people who live there. I think, in answer to Arlon's questions, that some of the things I have said here about projections and that sort of thing are very apropos. And I am not at all sure that comprehensive land use planning on is necessarily going to be, as we understand it today, the most adequate method of doing this, but we have no other. We've got to start somewhere to try to look at all of the various values which lands represent and to make the best adjustments, the best compromises that we can. And I further agree that I think the fact that we are in conflict and that we are able to stand up and to present the different values and the different viewpoints which we feel are pertinent, is probably one of the most useful tools that we have for finally resolving those conflicts. They're not going to be all resolved at any time. We're always going to have to give up something in order to get something else. But I think that we want to keep the price within the range of what we're willing to pay. And I think that comes down again to his final question, which could have been directed at me, I suppose, because I was very much in the battle for setting aside the Arctic wildlife range back in 1960, and that is, what would you do if you discovered all of the oil there? I think one of the answers that I would have to it was that I would like to see the United States doing a great deal more with the oil it has already before it's given this additional oil to play with in the present wasteful, extremely consumptive framework that we have today. I think that we've got a long way to go before we can say that we really are running out of oil in actual literal terms. We're wasting oil. We're wasting most of our resources in a profligate manner, and that is one of the fundamental problems that we have. And why get more out of the ground at the expense of wilderness, at the expense of wildlife habitat, at a great deal of expense to pour it down the same bottomless tube?
Our last panelist is Brad Tuck, who's the staff economist of the Land Use Planning Commission.
I kind of find myself in the position of saying what I wouldn't have said if I'd known what I know a couple of days ago. But at any event, I would make just a few comments, some of which have sort of been touched on already. But in my initial reaction to the title of the panel, Relating Use Philosophies to Management, it's an open topic, and the first point that I sort of felt was, is it a command, or is it a question, or precisely what is implied by the topic? And I think I would take it as a question. And in turn, that suggested to me three additional questions. Shall we relate, or should we relate, use philosophy to management? Secondly, do we relate use philosophy to management? And thirdly, can we make this relationship? And in answering the first of these questions, should we, I think that I would say yes, only if certain sort of necessary conditions can be met. And the first of these conditions is that we have a use philosophy or philosophies. Secondly, that the use philosophy is something which can be translated into operationally significant policy parameters. And a third necessary condition is that the management system must have in its power both the inclination, the capabilities, and the power and resources to implement such a philosophy in a way that leads to the desired land use patterns, in a way that the land use is in harmony with the expressed philosophy. And the fourth necessary condition, I would say, is that management must also operate under a clearly defined authority responsibility structure such that it is accountable for its actions and that it's responsive to evolution of the basic philosophy in which it's trying to implement, or at least have the capability of responding to needed changes in land use policy. Now, the second question, do we relate use philosophy to management? I think we can explore briefly by looking at the conditions necessary. And the first question I would ask is, do we have a land use philosophy? And in speculating on that, I would just suggest, what is a philosophy? And one place to answer that question is to go back to Introduction to Philosophy that most of us have gone through at one time or another. And just a couple of samples of what philosophy can be defined as is thinking, which seeks to discover connected truth about all available experience. Or an alternative definition is an inclusive and comprehensive view of all accessible experience. Well, I would suggest that a wilderness ethic, a boomer ethic, a conservation ethic, or something else isn't really what the word philosophy is all about. I think that philosophy relates to people, and that land use, when it becomes the focus, is a distortion of what we really should be concerned about. Land use is important only in the context in which it affects the quality of the individual's life. Land use is not an end in itself, and I think we lose track of what the real issues are when we make it that. And I would say that at this point, as far as Alaskan land use planning goes, we don't have a use philosophy. I think from that point, if you don't have the philosophy, you can't really translate it, and therefore you can't have a management system which relates use philosophy to management. Now, even if you want to take a narrower view of philosophy, I still don't really think that existing management systems are responsive to use philosophy. Do the existing management systems have the powers, so the policy instruments necessary? I think this question is one that is under consideration by the Land Use Planning Commission at this time, and I would certainly not want to prejudge the answer to that. But I think that, at least from what superficial investigation or look we've taken so far, the answer is no. The management system that is necessary to, for example, implement the recommendations of the Commission with regard to D2 lands probably doesn't exist. I think, in addition, the Commission's emphasis on regional land planning, or planning by region, attempting to encompass, in addition to the federal interest, both the state and the private sector interest, is a clear indication that we don't have the necessary management systems at this time. Now, in regard to this sort of third question, can we relate use philosophies to management systems? That answer, I think, depends upon whether or not we can establish some kind of use philosophy that is generally encompassing and is people-oriented. I think that if you can establish the philosophy, the management system, at least from a theoretical point of view, becomes more of a technical problem than anything else. From a more pragmatic point of view, it becomes a political problem of rather major scope, and there I would not even venture to speculate as to whether or not such a system could be created. I think the alternative to not creating such a system is that we return to or continue along a path in which management systems evolve to reflect not the interest of the public at large, but the interest of particular interest groups. And it may be that that actually offers a more viable solution than some grandiose attempt to plan for an overall quality of life. But I think that it's premature to make that conclusion.
We have about 20 or 25 minutes left for general discussion. So far, the panelists haven't really got into a struggle over